We're good to go.
All right, amazing. Thanks. So hi everyone, welcome to Kampala Open's schools category finals. We just want to congratulate the teams, the participants, and the judges that have been able to take this competition thus far. Team announcements. In opening government, we have Team Great Genesis, a team composed of Amos and Precious. In opening opposition, we have the team DDP, that's Leila and Luca. Closing government, the team, if you are doing well now, you can be weller. That's Lee V and Jason. And finally, closing opposition, the team, he doesn't know about this. That's the team of Chat, EAUX, and Stewie. On the panel, the school finals panel, we have Douglas T, congratulations. Sophia I, congratulations. Ferdinand D, congratulations. Beatriz M, congratulations. And myself, Rahim, we wish you the very best in the schools category finals. Prime Minister, blow us away. Here.
Confirming audibility.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So tonight's motion reads, this House opposes the construction of a coherent national identity as a way of understanding peoples. Now, I think it's quite essential to understand what this actually means. Basically, you look at construction of a coherent national identity as an active process by which states or schools in that manner promote a unified narrative of who a particular group of people are. Now, what this in turn is supposed to be done for is to find a way of understanding people, that through this identity as a primary lens, people can interpret others and find out what is actually necessary for them or just a way of easing life. Now, what do we say? We say that this is not something that is actually good because, first of all, where does this actually happen? We think that for something like a national story to be imposed, it must be imposed in a place where it can actually be done. Now, where have we seen these particular things happening? One, in places like Japan, where there is a high level of homogeneity in ethnicity or maybe in religion or that kind of sort. So we think that where there is a high level of likeness among people, it is then easier for you to implement this kind of thing. That therefore means that in places like Africa, where there's a lot of heterogeneous nations, where there are a lot of ethnicities or religions in that kind of regard, it then becomes hard for you to do this kind of thing. So this is a setting that we as team government are going to actually base ourselves. Now, why does this actually happen? It happens in these particular states like Japan because it's easier to implement. It's easy to come and bring up most of the people. If maybe say 70% of them are Japanese and speak maybe a particular or related languages, it therefore means that it's going to be easier for this to happen. This is why it's able, or this particular kind of people are able to implement this kind of thing. Next, where this can't happen, I've told you that this particular thing cannot happen in a place that has heterogeneous ethnicities or maybe religions or something of that sort. This is what we look at. And this is why we think that it cannot happen in the particular setting that we are giving you today. Now, this debate is not about whether people have identities. Obviously, people do have their identities. But it's about whether the state and society should intentionally construct one single and coherent national story that is going to help us understand the people of that particular state as a whole. Now, what do we see? The state in our world, the state does not prioritize a single national story. We also see that education, media, and maybe public discourse are plural and layered, have plural and layered identities, meaning regional, cultural, and ethnic. So why do we think that this is necessary? We think that this is necessary because each and every person in a particular state needs to be heard. Each and every particular group of peoples in a particular state need to be heard. If they are Baganda somewhere, and if maybe they are another tribe or actually somewhere, or maybe if they are Muslims, these particular people need to be heard. They need to be understood according to their identity, what they necessarily identify as. Now, they might say that maybe this particular thing creates a little bit of unity and eases governance. But we do not see this as so, because governance starts to fail where you start to maybe marginalize a certain group of people. There are groups of people who are so small in a particular country that sometimes it's easier to forget them. Now, when you try to create some sort of national story that helps you identify as one, it then becomes a problem, because even if you try to use this national story to understand it, you may not understand this minority of group of people that you've actually set aside. And this brings up to one core thing that actually stands on this page, and that is inclusivity. And we shall show you exactly why inclusivity does not necessarily stand in that particular in team opposition's house. Now, what do most states do? They teach one official history, promote national myths, and then expect citizens to subordinate others to that nation. Now, we think that this is problematical because in a place where there are different histories of particular people, you cannot come and actually maybe bring up one story. It's hard. We look at this as something hard, and maybe because yes, taken.
How do you ensure that you're going to reintegrate these small minority groups back into the general society to give them that reparative justice that you're talking about?
Now, what we see is that we are not going to reintegrate these people because these people are already part of the society. But what we think is that because people are minorities, it then puts them at a greater risk of actually having this particular national story, because you're going to marginalize them even further. Now, we think that this is going to create a lot of stereotypes because, because you have a certain idea on what you think people of this particular state are supposed to do, certain forms of behavior that you expect from them. And this then backfires because it does not necessarily apply to each and every particular person in a story because of difference in culture, norms, and anything of that sort. I talked about erasure of minorities as well. So we think that coherent national identity distorts reality and produces bad understanding. You realize that if a unified national identity works, it works by flattening difference. It compresses millions of lives into a single story. This is quite impractical because you realize minorities become footsteps, complex histories become myths. Now we look at this as something dangerous because you start to erase identities of people and start creating a false identity as a whole. We look at this as a problem because people are going to start feeling bad. You realize that it's going to produce epistemic injustice. People are misunderstood by default. Policies are built on fantasy and not reality. Basically, you're going to build a policy that you assume is going to be effective on each and every person in a particular story. Next, on exclusion, we think that people are going to be excluded in a particular regard because you're not paying attention to each and every person, but you're using this particular story that you've crafted falsely and on no basis to actually do this. Now, this is what we look at in this particular case. Now, it's essential to understand what team opposition might come and say. They might come and claim that national identity creates some sort of social cohesion, but we think that cohesion is not built on false sameness or false likeness. We think that this is wrong. It is fragile, and it is fragile. We think that people survive only when there is no crisis, there's no migration, and when there is no economic stress. These are the things that we actually look at to create some sort of social cohesion, not this particular kind of thing. We also think that if people are actually if we think that if people are actually complying with set rules and legal institutions, and people are not going or are not doing things that are necessarily out of the law or required of them, we think that these are things that are going to create social cohesion and not this particular national story that you may actually come to talk about. They might also say that it enables governance and cooperation, but we think that people do not cooperate because of one national story, because as we've shown you that this is going to be hard. But still, if we take them on that particular regard, we think that people cooperate because of laws that are being strengthened and are being followed up on incentives and mutual dependence and basically shared interests. If this is what people have and actually oppose these things, this is what's going to enable them have a certain sort of cooperation. Next, we also think that without national identity, they might say that without national identity, society fragments. But we think that this is not true. Fragmentation necessarily happens when groups feel erased. So allow me to summarize. So basically, this debate is not national identity versus chaos. It's just basically us refusing a false interpretation of a way that people should behave and a way in which people should be understood. I beg to rest.
Thank you for the fine speech, Prime Minister. Introducing the leader of opposition to open up the case for opening opposition. Here.
Just confirming that I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. POIs, please verbally. Cool. Ready to start in 3, 2, 1. The reason why in Iran there's a huge problem because of the Sunni-Shia divide is because there hasn't been a strong enough national identity created, and so other subgroups like religion take precedence. That causes things like infighting because individuals in a space or within a specific border are never going to see eye to eye with each other or see each other as one. National identity creates a mechanism to understand people that is based on respect as opposed to trying to prove superiority. What is our stance? We think that national identity is not perfect or exhaustive, i.e., it doesn't dissolve things like race, it doesn't dissolve things like religion. And we think rather it is created between an arbitrary border, so a bunch of random people that share specific life experiences, and so we think it is something that is able to encompass identity. What then is it? We think it's oftentimes just a practical framework to ensure things like large scale operation, but secondly, it's a societally useful tool because I don't think the government bench really understands the reality of what a national identity is. Yes, I'm Indian, yes, I'm Muslim, but most of all, I'm a South African person and I'm proud of that identity. Individuals are so paternalistic over their identities. That's why there were so many fights for things like sovereignty. We think that's something that they forget. What is the comparative though? Because there were no engagement that we got on the comparative. They need to prove why competing subgroups with no shared basis for governance would ever want to agree with each other, i.e., why different religious groups would ever agree to have the same level of governance or the same level of identity. Government's bench is rooted in idealistic frameworks. They're not able to provide space on a real framework. 2 points of response from them. They say that each and every person needs to be heard and understood. We think that national identity oftentimes encompasses everyone because it is based on shared life stories or the realities that people live, i.e., because they live within the same framework of borders, they experience the same weather or they're able to go to the same shops, etc. And an example of this is in South Africa. The Rainbow Nation encompasses every single identity within South Africa. We think that national identity can be nuanced and that would allow each and every person to be understood. But secondly, this doesn't take away from things like race and religion. We think that individuals are still able to experience that and they'd likely be heard in those facets. We think that's fine. They say that we create simplification on our side of the house. On their side of the house, the same thing happens because on their side of the house, they assume that people care or want to learn about other cultures. That's just not true. Think about tribalism in Africa or think about the Sunni Shia groups in Iran. On their side of the house, when you don't have a simplification or not even a simplification, a unification of groups of people, smaller groups are just going to fight with each other. And so you're never going to have each and every person be heard. You're rather going to have each and every person be killed. First argument then on societal cooperation. There's 3 things here. Firstly, when you create a shared national identity, you create shared expectations. So you have things like common norms about rights, duties, and what's acceptable and what's not. I.e., you're able to create a basis for law, a basis for respect with each other, because you don't create things like a cost between strangers. You don't create things where people see each other as a divide and rather they see each other as a means of respect. Secondly, you create trust at a larger scale. That is because you trust people and you trust institutions because you're seen as individuals coming from the same overarching identity. Think about when you're in another country and you see someone from the same country as you. You're able to engage with them because you trust them more because you think there is something that bonds the two of you. Because of this bond, we think individuals are far more likely to do things like pay taxes or obey laws because they respect everybody in the country that follows the same national identity and they respect institutions because they think those institutions share similarities to them. But thirdly, you're far more able to do things like have collective action for 2 reasons. One, borders within countries means that you have a concentrated amount of people in the same space, but that you're also able to have a concentrated national and identity between the two of you. This doesn't exist because the religious diaspora spans across the world and race also expands across the world. You're never able to cultivate the entirety of your race or the entirety of your religion to do something you can for your national identity. This means you're able to do far more. Think about protests in Iran that are able to fight things like harmful regimes because they value the respect of their neighbor regardless of the color of their neighbor. What is the comparative? Smaller subgroups like religion are always going to have infighting because they always need to prove their superiority, because they see a divide between a Christian and a Muslim person, and so they're never going to be able to do things like have collective action, like bring about change, or like have laws that each and every person will respect. Why is this important? Because we think that if you're going to live in the same area as individuals, you ought be able to have an amicable life space. The only way to understand the person next to you is if you respect them, and the only way to respect them is if you have a commonality between the two. In this case, it is identity. Secondly, this identity is incredibly legitimate. 3 reasons. 1, because societal constructs shape behavior. There is no real distinction between like a woman and a trans, or a woman and a cisgendered, like a woman and a, yes, there's no difference between a woman and a transgender woman, but we think we create difference in terms of identities and in terms of social and societal norms. What does that mean? It means that national identity works only because people believe in it. Only because I believe that if there is a distinct South African identity, can I identify as South African, and can I want to protect the African individuals. We think that people can only believe in this when they have pride in their identity. And so we think that it is legitimate because you create a construct where individuals respect each other and have pride in themselves is incredibly legitimate. Government still needs to prove why we ought to take that away. But secondly, you're able to have increased purpose and continuity. That is because things like your national identity don't have terms and conditions. You don't have to pray to a certain God to be a certain identity. And so oftentimes you're able to have individuals have shared stories and want to care about the people that are around them because they don't have to owe them anything back. They can simply just be. Thirdly, though, these identities are incredibly adaptable. Given the fact that they were constructed identities, they can be reshaped if it is necessary. That means that you're able to do things like change if there's a necessity to. An example of this is Rwanda. They've removed separate identities like Hutu and Tutsi people because they've caused lots of infighting, and so instead you have a distinct Rwandan identity that protects the peace. That's not something you're able to do with religion or like race, because those are things that you cannot change. I cannot change the words in the Bible. I cannot change the color of my skin. Given the fact that you're unable to change those things, you're never able to mechanize you're never able to create ways to change the society that you exist in for the better for you. Why is this argument important? Because my identity is something that is incredibly central to me. That's why you have things like fighting for like the betterment of identity. We think that you're only able to like engage with people and engage with understanding people at a point at which you see them eye to eye. We don't think that happens on the comparative because you have lots of infighting, because individuals are paternal to their different identities that is different for everyone. This entire speech has proven to you that the reason why we're all important is because we're important to someone else, and on opposition side you don't create that. We're so proud to be opening up.
Thank you for the fine speech, Leader of Opposition, inviting the Deputy Prime Minister to extend for opening government. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I begin my speech in 3, 2, and 1. So, Chair, the reason as to why things like wiping out of minority groups in Myanmar are happening is because, as my Prime Minister has already explained, it's because countries are fighting to compress different identities into one. So this practically means that the Muslims in Myanmar are being wiped out. Why? Because the country believes that it should have one identity. It believes that they should only be identified as one people under the borders. So first chart we get from opening opposition. So they believe the reason as to why they are creating a national identity is because they are going to create society unity, whereby people based on singular norms, people trust each other on a large scale, people share the same things, and people are identified under one thing. Notice, my Prime Minister already explains to you, in societies which have diverse tribes, for example, African countries, this is something that is practically impossible. Why? We are going to exclude the minority. Or firstly, I think one of the things why this is very impossible is one, complacency. The Am I audible?
Yes, you are now. I had you paused at 1 minute, 33 seconds, so you can resume from there.
Okay. I resume in 1, 2, 3. So the Prime Minister already paints for you a picture where we have diverse tribes, where people are not only categorized under culture, but cultural systems that are also categorized under religional systems. The reason as to
POI.
why you take you later. The reason as to why we oppose a coherent national identity is one. These people exist in different societies. By the time you get to compress them or fidget them under one stereotype, under one national identity, we are going to see things like societal unity or the things opposition is fronting for being destroyed at the end of the day. Why? Because you're going to compress these different small groups, you're going to exclude the minorities. So they give us examples like in Rome, or where the countries are based on things like Catholicism. So notice this means there is a lot of exclusion. Meaning, if you're a Muslim and you reside in a country like Rome, your opinion, the likelihood of people buying into your idea is something that is very small. Why? Because society has already shaped Catholics as the heads of the society, or Rome is its national identity is Catholicism. So this means that you're going to be excluded. This means that your opinion does not matter at the end of the day. So we tell you that for the setting where we say African nations,
POI.
these are nations that are very diverse. These are nations that are having very many tribes. So you creating a national identity, you're going to leave out the minorities, which is going to become problematic at the end of the day. How? This is going to undermine inclusivity, where people who do not fit under a particular national identity are marginalized. This is why we see things like racism. This is why we would see when the blacks would go to America, they would be considered as outsiders. This is why we see Mexicans do not necessarily get green cards in America. Why? Because they are seen as outsiders. Because America has already set its kind of national identity, where the people who do not fit in that kind of identity are seen as outsiders. This is why we continuously see things like xenophobia, where people from different races, where people from diverse races are often seen as outsiders and are not considered in particular societies. So notice, identity is something that already exists. So meaning that from that side of the house, they say the reason as to why things like the Tutsi and Hutu were exist, or the genocide in Rwanda existed because of Tutsi and Hutu, because Rwanda did not necessarily have a national identity. Notice, this is something that is false. Why? Because Rwanda was prioritizing the Tutsi over the Hutu. This is why they were fighting, because they were trying to create a national identity where the Tutsi are superior over the Hutu. This is why things like the genocide happen. But because Rwanda has now acknowledged both races, or both society groups as things that are equal, are as groups of people that both that deserve attention. This is why things like genocides are no longer being seen. But we see things like genocides or things like racism continuously happening from team opposition's bench. Why? Because they are trying to force people to buy into ideas to buy into ideas where certain groups of people are suddenly greater or better than other people. So notice, I think they lose out on complacency firstly, because when you try to create a national identity, meaning you're going to set these are things. This is where society is going to set how different norms or different religions particularly happened within different societies. The problem then becomes is that different diverse cultures always have diverse norms, diverse practices. So this means you're going to leave out particular groups of people. And from team opposition, they may argue that identity is personal, or if you meet someone in another country, this is something that so they argue that because if we do not allow a national identity, we are going to see small groups fighting against each other. Notice, this is something that is a fallacy in today's debate. Why? Because, for example, in countries like Uganda, we see politics thriving. Why? Because people always have different MPs from different cultures, from different districts, always representing them. The problem then becomes when we create a national identity. This means people from diverse cultures will not get an opportunity to be included in national matters or to be represented at a national level. Why then this exists from outside of the house, and the importance of this is that different groups get to be represented, different groups get to give up their ideas, and at the end of the day, we are going to see fairness with that.
All right, thanks DPM for the fine speech, welcoming the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the opening half. Here.
I assume you can hear me.
The assumption is true.
Thank you. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. A national identity is a special identity because it is the only type of identity that is able to encompass every type of individual based on nothing but the country that you live in. What that means is that any other type of intersectionality, like your race, like your religion, is disregarded when you talk about the identity like a national identity. But furthermore, individuals are more complete than one type of identity. What that means is that in our world, you are able to people keep messaging. In our world, you are able to look at, you are able to be a Catholic person, you're able to be a Black person, but you're also able to be Nigerian in that case. So a national identity is able to encompass some type of, one of your types of identity, and you're able to understand people in a multifaceted way. A few responses to opening government before an argument later about how we are able to reduce racism. They give us a few things. They tell us, one, that national identity creates expected behavior upon individuals, like flattening the difference and simplifying complexities. Secondly, that it creates exclusion because there's one stereotype, and this is extremely fragile and will be removed in a crisis. But then thirdly, it is going to create infighting. 5 responses to these ideas. Firstly, they rest on the assumption that individuals in the same countries are extremely different. And this is something that is just not true, because everyone that lives in the same country still has some shared lived experience. What that means is that countries are not only borders. You have stuff like economic status, the same types of leadership, the same types of policy. So if there's no power in your country, everyone experiences general power. If there's no water, that sort of thing. If there's a housing crisis, everyone experiences that, meaning you have shared problems when you exist within the same country. So you do have stuff to relate to, and that can encompass part of your national identity. Secondly, this is especially necessary in diverse countries, because without the existence of a national identity, the people's identity that they rely on is based on the certain groups within a country. This is why in places like Yemen, there's extreme tribal infighting, because there's no one unified country. It is different sides or different groups within the country fighting against each other for dominant control. If countries like these decide to become one or national country, you're able to unite the individuals by having a shared identity and shared social cohesion. Thirdly, we are still able to have shared intersectionality. So the idea that national identity simplifies individuals is just not true, because you are able to identify as a part of a certain country, but you're able to still be multifaceted as individuals. The motion is not only about identifying individuals as their identity being that they are only from their country. It is that the idea that individuals are multifaceted. So the motion says it's as a way of understanding individuals. This is just one way of understanding individuals. So I can look at someone and say, oh, they are South African and they are Catholic and they are Black in the same way. So I can understand the different types of identities of the individual, which is able to create more platforms for social cohesion among those individuals, especially in extremely diverse countries where there's already been differences in the past around them. Fourthly, then, national identity is not only based on your country entirely. Because if there's no it is only based on your country entirely, because national identity doesn't encompass things like religion. So if there's no identity in the country of Rome, it means that everyone is able to do this. But if with the removal of the identity, what opening government says is going to happen, well, what is going to happen on our side will happen on their side. So the idea that like Catholic will take over inside of Italy means that is going to be the dominant narrative or the dominant identity. So anyone that doesn't identify with being Catholic is going to be excluded. Comparatively, then on our side, you're able to be Roman and be a Muslim, so you're able to identify with the national identity and be able to create social cohesion with those individuals. With the absence of this national identity, things like other forms of creating social group is going to take over. But let's assume that they're like actually proven that the better type of case that you get simplicity entirely, because this is still not all that individuals become simple. This is still not true, because national identity is able to encompass everyone entirely inside the entire country. So it prevents things like infighting, especially in these diverse countries. On the way up there, firstly, our case, we told you a few things. First, that you get social cooperation, and secondly, that it's a legitimate identity for individuals, because everyone all belong in the same country. On the way up, 3 reasons that we weigh higher against them. Firstly, we get long-term cohesion. We get more long-term cohesion among individuals, because now we have a long-term standing as a country, because the country is going to last longer and throughout generations. So when different cultures change and adapt throughout society, we're still able to identify as the same in the long term. Secondly, in terms of urgency, because especially in times where there's been diverse or there's just been a crisis before where there's been lots of infighting within your country, we need the construction of as a national identity to be able to understand people. So we're able to have social cohesion in the long term, and the country is able to survive. But then thirdly, on scale, because the more people are able to be included within this national identity, so more people are able to understand each other and have this sort of social cohesion. Next, then, an argument about how we are able to reduce racism in society, or racism, especially in like post-conflict societies. This rests on the understanding that, especially in these societies, there are stereotypes that exist based on your identity, which has created like an us versus them idea, especially in like post-colonial states, in places like apartheid South Africa, where there's been a white identity and a black identity, and it's been an us versus them, or in Rwanda, where there's been like the Hutus versus the Tutsis, or in the USA, where there's a civil, like Martin Luther King versus the US government. There's been stereotypes and social norms created. The other side is worse, and these often still exist long after the post-colonial society. This is why creating a national identity is extremely important in this case. We are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, because when you have a shared identity, you have a common ground for discourse. What this does is it counters the ability for difference. So when a part of national identity is doing stuff like building a sports team. So when you build the South African rugby team, everyone is able to be unified and watch the same rugby team and have discourse around them, and you're able to be unified as a country entirely. So things like stuff like sports teams, which is part of your national identity. In places, this is especially bad in places like Spain, where people can be the same, they can all be white and Catholic in Spain, but because they're just from Catalonia and they're from Spain, they have this types of conflict. When you have a lack of national identity, you aren't able to be united. Secondly, it shifts loyalty away from previous races to building a nation, because now you have shared goals like being able to participate in democracy together, especially in places, for example, like in Nazi Germany, you're able to remove these ties to the political party of like the Nazis and like, or maybe Jewish people or anti-Nazis. So you're able to remove that and build a new type of Germany and construct a new national identity, so people are able to work in cohesion. Because it's especially important because the newer generations are often not part of the previous conflict. They just suffer from the effects of that previous conflict. But thirdly, we're able to break down harmful stereotypes. This is especially true because propaganda has been created in places like Rwanda. There's propaganda part the other side. So ultimately, this is important because we are still able to have intersectionality, but we are still able to build a nation on our side. Comparatively on their side, they have no way to unite people, which means that the old stereotypes stay, and the old stereotypes is what's going to take over in those countries.
Thank you for the fine speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition. I implore all speakers to keep time on their end, whether that is you to know when to ask for points of engagement or to take them. That aside, welcoming the member of government to open up the back half of the debate. Here.
Hi, can I have a moment to fix my notes, set my timer, and mentally condition myself? Thank you. Hi. I'm back. Just to confirm, am I loud and clear?
You're audible.
Okay, before I start my speech, couple of shout outs. Shout out to the other Philippine team who is here. Our closing opposition, Chat and Stewie. Shout out also to my kids in InsDS. I know that it was our goal to share the grand final stage together and it was already close, but I hope that next edition, you're already the one who will be in this position. But thank you to Harvest 6 also and to Outspoken. I hope that I do justice to this wonderful motion. Hi, Jason, who preferred pronouns, POI's voice, preferably during the 4 to 5 minute mark, but I cannot guarantee that I can accept one. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. The construction of a coherent national identity means unification of cultures in a nation, not solely because you want to improve the understanding of people towards each other, thus being able to unify and mobilize them. But that's just a facade on opposition side. What the unification implies is a simplification. It's systematically ignoring smaller regions and cultures in the country and assumingly integrating them to a larger cultural framework that involves the most prominent culture in one nation. This doesn't truly highlight them and allow the people to understand their importance. This is being done as a short-term solution because state actors believe that it's hard to highlight them solely, and because of that, they are foreshadowed instead by prominent cultures that is already nationally known. What are the most important contexts that closing government posits? Three things. Number one, despite being a part of a nation, there are different regions, thus various cultures. Because do take note that subcultures exist even in small groups. The thing is, regional cultures have different levels of understanding because of geography and proximity. This means that larger regions are more well known than others comparatively, like smaller regions cultures are not as well known. This is important because this proves that when we want people's understanding, there must be a prioritization because their status of being known being known or their popularity varies. It's counterproductive to continuously push prominent cultures under the coherent national identity because their exposure is already enough. Thus, the focus should be on smaller regions, and we proved how this isn't achieved under the unification. But second, then, the prerequisite to the proper construction of a coherent national identity is balance. But that is unlikely to be achieved. There's various culture in one country alone, which means that it's impossible that it will be balanced because balance looks like having an equal representation and importance to each culture and region. We cannot merge them and assume that it's justified because it's similar, because that's not just simplifying it, but it's also disrespectful to the population that belongs to that culture. They are promised visibility and understanding, but what they get is erasure. Similar doesn't mean the same. The differences is what sets the culture apart. It's when we're able to distinguish and identify them. This is important because it already proves how the mechanization behind the construction of coherence is systematically flawed. But third, then, when a state constructs a coherent national identity, it often creates rules of narratives about what acceptable culture, symbols, language, or even behavior. This freezes culture into a static state-approved template instead of allowing it to evolve naturally. People are forced to prioritize conforming to the national narrative over pursuing their own cultural like identity, right? Even if there's a singular like region that has a culture that's fading and you want to highlight that, it means that it can't be symmetrically represented for two reasons. Number one, it will not be done properly. Feasible doesn't always mean effectivity. That's something that you need to understand. What the most likely scenario here is that it will piss people off because it will imply that some cultures are more dominant, and being dominant means being more valuable towards others, right? But second, then, if you assume that the unification is good because of the assumption that cultural differences is what pits us against each other, that's simply not true. Most of the time, regional conflicts happen because of a fight for resources, differences in politics that doesn't allow them to cooperate with each other, or even religion that throughout history is often compared in the pursuit of proving dominance. This is important
POICO.
because it means that culture is not the point, because this proves that culture is not the tipping point. Thus, the construction of a coherent national identity isn't a solution because regardless if this exists, the conflicts and issues will still arise because those are not uniquely and exclusively rooted in cultural identity. Note that this debunks the entirety of opposition because this is their way of proving these benefits, and this is precisely how we destroy it, right? What is the simple extension that I will like posit for coming from closing government, right? Extension number one. one, national cooperation would decline and the unification would lead to a larger divide. Constructing a coherent identity often privileges certain cultural groups or norms over others. This privilege can translate into economic and political advantages for those aligned with the dominant narrative. Examples, better access to
POI.
jobs, education, or like political possessions. Those are already something that are a disadvantage like in the status quo right now. Marginalized groups are actually like sidelined, not because of merit, but because their culture doesn't align with the national story that we're actually like trying to create. Before I posit two structural reasons, yes, what's your POI?
Is your problem with the existence of national identities or with national identities that turn out to be bad?
I think that what you don't understand here within this debate is a national identity already exists. How you belong and identify within a country already exists. You don't need to like unify this. You don't need to unify regional cultures just for you to be like distinguished or properly highlighted. If you want to be understood, then the difference is actually like integral. That shouldn't be something that's erased. Two reasons as to why. Number one, there's an incentive to erase other regional culture because oftentimes some cultural practices and beliefs are contradictory, and this kills the coherence that opposition is pushing for. Meaning then, this narrative chooses what is deemed as good and bad as a basis for removal, right?
POI.
But second, that B, bargaining power from larger authorities and government units exists. Smaller countries are not represented properly, and even if you assume that indirect representation by other proximate regions happens, it's still not authentic representation. What is the impact to this? This like gives them like this directs them to the problem that they are trying to solve. Social inequality grows, public trust in government decreases, economic productivity may decline as diverse groups are excluded from contributing fully. No, I will no longer accept like POIs. But moving on then, why do we win this debate? We win this debate through this one simple thing. Why is the existing national identity on the comparative of closing government better? Number one, note that the national identity isn't only bound by similarity. What allows us to value each other is our cultural differences, because this highlights how even if we are a part of the same country, there are still distinct differences that sets us apart. This is bound by our ancestors and history, and despite being good or bad, it's still part of our identity. That's something that we need to value. You need to understand that we want better way of understanding for people in this debate. This exists precisely because we have differences that we want to understand each other in order for us to cooperate better and create a middle ground that opposition also wants. If we have a coherent identity, it doesn't allow us to understand each other. It just shows how we are unwilling to understand each other, because instead of truly acknowledging the differences, instead of learning each other's cultures and meeting each other like on the middle ground, we are simply like shunning this away. Instead, we are creating a mechanization that allows us to not be one with each other, but to be the same as each other. You are imposing the same identity to everyone, thus changing them completely. Culture is big, but people don't understand like people very well, right? You can still learn other culture on like the internet or in the internet or schools, because this is just something that's systematically like, taught to us. Because like a part of our national identity is already understanding each other. Like in the Philippines, what is our national identity or like national value? It's bayanihan, it's being makatao, and that's already enough for us to like bind with each other, even with our differences, right? Even with all of those said and done, proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for the fine speech. Guys, I hate interrupting someone's heated speech. Please keep your time. And yeah, let's have a lovely finals. That aside, welcoming the member of opposition to open up the case for closing opposition. Here.
Hi, pronouns POI, preferably closing, and shout out to CG as well. Okay. Wait, let me have my timer. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. We live in a world where people can no longer agree on what is true, let alone who we are. Scroll your feed for 5 minutes and you'll see 5 different realities, different facts, different villains, different heroes. In a post-truth world like this, the real danger isn't that national identity simplifies. It's that without it, we lose any shared way of understanding each other at all. That's why even if you do not have a national identity, you are already competing with other identities that stems from colonial influence. The importance of this introduction is that it prefaces two exclusive framing here in closing opposition. One, the people who crave identity the most are oftentimes those who were freed from colonial influence and are at conflict with other people or race or geography proximate to them. This is like people in the Philippines divided by the differences of social perception of those in Mindanao and Luzon. These are people who crave attention but have always been hostile because they have gotten trauma from intersecting with other people. These are people who are scared that after creating their own forms of writing and language would be burned to ashes again. That's why side government cannot automatically claim that absent that national identity, those very fragmented peoples have the incentive to continuously outwardly coalesce with other groups when they've been far too wounded and have internalized that other groups are going to be hostile against them again. This framing engages as well how OG is wrong to say that these marginalized groups are already groups of the society. At best, you allow them to create communities, but they cannot fiat that different communities would integrate with each other on their end. But three, this also means that during moments when you are still finding identity, it's during times when social superstructures are still vulnerable and still under construction as well. But secondly, we live in a post-truth society. Versions of history have been divisive in nature and it's continuously blurred which country has been right or wrong, e.g. how Filipinos and Spanish people portray Lapu-Lapu or Magellan as a hostile individual depending on their race. It has always been about records and getting higher reach and influence that makes people believe. But beyond that, this is not about clashing and correcting narratives, especially if you are up against a country or race that have long established their dominance in the world. You can never get solvency when you continuously choose to clash against them. What matters is that at the very least, you are able to establish a form of identity that reaches far and wide, something that can be adaptively recorded and constructed as time passes by. This is where I reframe what construction means, because there's an assumption in this debate that construction is static. No, in opposition, construction is likely to be dynamic when different groups are able to share how certain values or cultures show their identity. This looks like validating different religions like Christian and Muslim coexisting in one country. This looks like the consideration of language where you integrate. Here's where I'm going to answer Gov's question, that probably there's still a dominance of narratives or culture in that mixture. The question is it harmful? This is the question that OO never answers, deadlocking them against government. 3 layers. Firstly, no. Even if one culture dominates over the other, it's probably likely because it's the most palatable for everyone. E.g., even if the Filipino language considers the Tagalog language the most, it's because it was the most understood language for reformation geopolitically. But secondly, national identity and regional identity can coexist in nature. The difference is on the scale of influence, but the aid to that is on the proximity at which the influence of identity is necessary. Even if you're not able to share your own regionalness identity nationally or internationally, you can still share it regionally and pass it on towards the future generation. What's necessary is for the society at large to consider that your community is still significant. But thirdly, is it really a harm if the information is minimal in nature? I think not. We may use the English language right now, but I don't think that this language destroyed different languages. Translations would always exist. What is not guaranteed is people being accepted to translate things. Those minimal information is a necessary prerequisite in order for deeper language learning or language to penetrate. So even if it's a harm in the worst because it overrides different language, I say it's a necessary birthing pain because in the long run, with the nuanced construction, you are still able to dynamically extend other information, e.g. more Bisaya language like ambot being integrated in the Filipino language, or the Filipino term barangay now included in the English dictionaries, or this looks like even Christian religion having different branches like Roman Catholic and what have you. The extension in CO is simple. Why you incentivize groups to coalesce far more, and why that form of coalition is sufficient to create better narratives, better social superstructures. This is an exclusive horizontal contribution insofar as OO never proved the incentive for certain groups to want to accept you. So validation is internal at best in opening opposition but not external. 4 layers to this. 1, this is about opticality. The willingness to want to coalesce with other groups paints both ends, that you are able to show that those previous grievances do not have to be necessarily shown in an extremist and radicalized manner that destroys each other. This means that you disincentivize both ends to try to continuously perpetuate narratives that are oppressive one over the other. Instead, they are likely going to focus to be far more constructive and try to create more structure and develop. That form of shared development is where you immortalize your contributions with each other and consider each other's importance. That's how you show to the other parts of the world that they are not hostile and overshadow those oppressive narratives that previously exist. But 2, this is about your capacity to continuously participate. I think that even if side government asserts that participation still exists on their end, which is not vividly shown, they did not necessarily prove acceptance. At best, what you would see during these occasions are unhealed wounds and differences. So even if they coalesce, you see a lot of infighting against each other. But to engage in Gov's case against us about simplification and complexity, they never proved the extent of complexity, by the way. I think that the margin is negligible as far as individuals' identities have always always been complex in nature. But even in the better case that people suddenly want to coalesce with each other, which they never essentially prove the impetus to want to coalesce with each other, I think it's harder because people have to study each other's individuals' identities in order to progress. That's why even if your national identity is going to be complex, what this second layer proves is that you still have the continuous soft power to shape it and continuous power to show the shared identity, e.g. the same case in China and Taiwan. The last two are even ifs. Even if you're not able to show and shine to the world your own version of grievances and truth, at least society validates your actions. That's where you get that form of soft power. That even if you're deadlocked against other countries or groups perpetuating narratives, at least more people believe you. At least more people would want to coalesce and try to invest towards you. But fourthly, or second, even with overlapping priorities for identities, I think it's still justified for some other identity to be disregarded. This is the only significant bullet being bitten in this entire debate. I suggest that the priorities of identities are symmetric on both ends, and no one would ever accept that the other version is right. The biggest safety net is that even if your own regional identity is rejected, at least you still have that national identity that you can cling on to, where people can believe on and invest on. Three things to conclude that ends this debate, even if I'm not a whip. One, you are able to permanently develop a developing state, a transitional state, or country. It's only when you are accepted, when they want to continuously invest towards you. That's where you cement yourself towards history, when your physical influence cannot be easily overshadowed by words. That's where you are able to see a shop that sells chicken biryani or pastil, even in huge malls in the central Philippines. But secondly, you are able to reject and deject those previous colonial influences because, guys, your own regional identity is already previously competing with an external force, e.g. colonial influence like what happened in the Philippines. You can never combat that with differing interpretations of different identities. The only force that's encountered acted is national identity itself. But three, because the dynamics of identity formation is something that's preserved. When the perspective for what's right is something that comes from different people, it's where you are able to co-opt this. Guys, formation is not instant in one time. It can still change and you can still get that inside opposition. All those reasons, CO.
Thank you for the fine speech, member of opposition. That will now bring us to the government whip to wrap up case for the bench and closing government. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I'm not getting any audio feedback from you. Could someone just confirm in the chat that it's not just me? Okay, they are not audible. Partner Jason, you're gonna have to reach out to Gavin.
I'm so sorry. I'm already conducting her.
Amazing.
Hello? Hello, is this better? I've changed devices.
Yeah. This is better.
Hello? Is this better? Wait.
Yes, you're audible. Please start, Ne. Please
Okay.
start.
Oh my.
I think her connectivity issue is bad.
What's that? Say that again.
I think her connectivity issue is bad. She's currently unmuted, but we can't hear anything.
I could hear her before. Could you just tell her to switch devices? Because she's already 3 minutes out of her speech. I'm gonna give a convenience of 2 more minutes.
Okay. Is this hello? Hello, is this better?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to start off now. Okay, I'm going to start off my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, I think they don't really understand what Jason have been saying right from the very get-go. I think that first, different perspectives and the stigmatization that we impose on the other region is not because of the differences. It's because of the refusal to understand each other. We prove to you, regardless how people are likely to understand each other, eradicating the oppressive narratives can be done through a coherent national identity. Because note that people values like things differences uniquely. You aren't able to change the perspective by allowing them to operate under the same culture as you. If you want to eradicate these harms, it's more proximate for people to make others understand them better through connection because it's not coercive. It's when we can show them the truth. This of itself is bridging the gap. The prerequisite to understanding is cultural security and acceptance, not unification. If I'm secure being an Ilocano, I don't need to fight those who are Bisaya, right? This proves how we value our differences in identity first before understanding. This is why the current national identity is better. First, I think that how we question how are we still able to understand and cooperate with each other despite our differences? One, it's appreciation. We don't claim what we don't own, but rather we connect to enjoy what they have because they are also willing to share the experience
POICO.
that they grew up with later. Second, culture evolves, but it doesn't mean erasure. It just means that we are acknowledging that this culture doesn't serve us anymore. We are decreasing poor practice in it, but we are not forgetting it because it's a part of history. Meaning then we are evolving together based on what we need right now, and this is symmetric to every region. But also I have to really understand that we also have to understand that cultural security as is the prerequisite of like civic cohesion. This is uniquely to closing government because we show that stable cooperation requires secural of cultural identities at the local level. Individuals must feel their culture protected, right? Only then we can voluntary cultural respect occur. Coercive construction of singular national identity strips that security and therefore undermines cooperation rather than building it. Why is it only exclusive in our side? Opening government and open government argue for unity via like a manufactured coherence. In our extension argues the like argues the opposite, right? First then, in context of cultural freezing and like authenticity loss, state construction fossilizes selected traits into official culture. Culture is dynamic. Freezing reduces creativity, erases minority practice, and funneling arts or education funding toward orthodoxy, right? Which is the result of which is the result of this. Cultural industries and social movements lose authenticity and legitimacy. In terms of political and economic exclusion, official identity becomes a gatekeeper for a reward structure like jobs, education, and political appointment. Privilege occurs to groups aligned with their narrative. Others are sidelined. This lowers human capital utilization and increased inequality. In terms of alienation, citizens whose identity are othered feel illegitimate in civic life. Lower trust and turnout, weaker public goods provision, and rise in passive resistance or separatist movement follow. Fourth, backlash. Where the state imposes identity, suppresses identities don't vanish. They radicalize or secede, right? This increases conflict risk and destabilizes the polity, right? These mechanisms are highly probable when construction is attempted because states naturally centralize resource and symbolic power. Consequences are systematic and high magnitude and largely irreversible in the medium of in the in the medium term once cultures are erased and political like ossifies, right? So OG told you that coherence create unity and shared like prevents tribalism. I think that only in our side that when you look at it, coercive cohesion removes cultural security, the
POI.
precondition for voluntary mutual respect, right? Without security, right? We without security, right? Also, like the unity is brittle, right? Also, like also claims that national identity is inclusive, nuanced, and reduces racism, and it's a practical tool. In our simple sense, in theory, national narratives can be inclusive. In practice, state construction privileges symbols and simplifies this complexity. Nuanced pluralism is not the same thing as single constructed narrative. Our extension gives a better a practical tool, protect plural narratives and invest in shared civic
Point.
institutions that coordinate action without reducing identity to one story. This is both inclusive and less risky. Third then, right? NCO claims, right, coexistence is possible. National identity can be pluralistic. If they mean a genuine emergent or like bottom up rural like national culture, we agree, but that is not the motion's target. The motion targets the construction of a coherent identity as a way of understanding peoples, so top down like understanding, right? So CEO's concession that plurality can
POI.
exist collapses into their model. We are the only house that both projects top down like construction and offers operational and institutional alternative. Yes, what's your POI? The grill,
If
I guess that's what.
infighting is bad with national unity in place, it's going to be worse without. We give you this chat in OO and CO is derivative to it, yet you don't engage.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the likelihood, actually, the comparative weighing. Why closing government wins in the first place? Which outcome is going to be more likely? In our side, when it comes to the top-down construction, it's going to be very likely to create exclusion and ossified narratives because states have to incentivize to simplify and centralize. When it comes to the bottom-up plural frameworks, more likely to preserve the diversity and like a lot of cooperation. And so it means that it's going to be likely to cause. When it comes to magnitude, which impact is better? Forced identity causes systemic disenfranchisement and civil unrest and economic misallocation. It's all high in magnitude. The benefits that OG claims are lower magnitude relative to the cost, right? And third, when it comes to the moral cost itself, the erasure of minority languages and cultures is often irreversible or costly to repair. It carries a high moral harm, and our alternative preserves culture and is reversible, restorative, and less morally fraught, right? We hijack OG's benefits. OG wants cohesion and cooperation. Our model provides the same outcome but more robustly by securing identities first, then building civic institution that incentivizes cross-cultural collaboration. This demonstrates mutual exclusivity. You cannot both build cultural security and coerce a single coherent identity at a scale that the latter cuts the former, right? So why do we win, right? When it comes to the impacts, justice, we are preventing the cultural elation and political marginalization is a moral imperative. Second, when it comes to stability, our approach reduces the probability of secession, insurgency, and chronic instability. And third, prosperity, preserving cultural industries and utilizing diverse human capital increases innovation, tourism, and economic productivity that's still prevalent, right? And lastly, when it comes to legitimacy, governments that respect plural narratives gain trust and civic participation, the real engine to actually sustainability. So when you look at it, this is going to be a closing government win. And I end my speech.
Thank you for the fine speech, Gab Whip. That brings us to the last speaker of the round, Opposition Whip, to wrap up the case for bench and closing opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
All right, so thank you very much for that confirmation. First, shout out kina Kuya Jason and Ate Jam. Hi guys. It's our second time meeting in this tournament, and also shout out to Stewie. This is like our first official grands together. Okay, so starting my speech in 3. Oh, by the way, PYs, I don't think I can take one because I have a lot to say. I unfortunately wrote too much. So, but rest assured that I will try my best to engage on every single bench that talked in this grand finals to make it a high quality debate at the very end. Starting my speech in 3, 2, starting my speech in 3, 2, One, I want to be very clear on what the contributions of member of opposition gave that crucially cleared the deadlock that happened in opening exchange that even closing government did not engage on. This debate was never just about how you ought to give visibility to minority communities, but it's more on how you integrate them towards the general society for a far more tangible and incremental type of social reparative justice and reforms which the state morally owes them. What Stewie was able to explain to you was that these constructions of national identities more often than not are situated within post-colonial societies or states, for example, like the Philippines, where there are vast majorities or like vast different factions of unique identities and cultures that are scattered throughout the region just because of the geographic differences that's existing within status quo. This means that more likely than not, in retrospect, these communities deliberately chose to close themselves off from the majority of the general society because of certain reasons, e.g. geographical placement, where they develop less compared to the more centralized people within metro areas, for example, who get to develop and innovate much faster because of cross engagement with resources and such is something that catalyzes the system and is something that's much more centralized or prominent within these urban areas. For example, this mechanism at large paints exactly how minority groups functions in the very first place within status quo. More likely than not, they deliberately shut themselves on from this developing society because of reasons such as self-preservation and protectionism. And this is really doubled on from the premise from closing government. This proves how the premise of opening opposition is too assertive. You don't automatically ensure that the general society will integrate or accept these minority communities. In fact, we agree with the opening government when they called out that there are immediate harms that come with the construction of national identity and such as like possible false identities, and their call out on opening opposition was right. More likely than not, opening opposition is something that's exclusionary. How do we fix this exclusively on opening opposition? The first thing that I want to prove here is just on the thing that you get from opening opposition is that suddenly people will be completely happy and homologous. We think that this simply isn't the case. This is exclusionary because only the privileged people are the ones who can subscribe to the narrative of a singular national identity because they're the ones who suffer less. They're the ones who don't get disregarded by the national policies, e.g. indigenous people. Opening opposition never proved how the general society will integrate the minority groups. You don't integrate them just because they live under the same climate or same country. What Stewie was able to talk about is how these minority groups are currently having an extent of representation within Congress, for example, e.g. how local communities or indigenous groups have representative or district seats within the parliament where they can clamor for better policy lobbying. Note that we're operating within the current status quo or progressive status quo where minorities are getting recognized by major activist movements. This is how you have humane discourse and political hedging when it comes to like securing a security of your own autonomous and unique culture or identity, for example, or at the very least, as Stewie proves, for example, understanding by the general society or acceptance at best. This is where I double down from the meta coming from government web. We want to take the risk or like the immediate harms of like secessions and continuous infighting or uprisings, for example, because it's the exact prerequisite for you to see eye to eye and find compromise within the state, for example, between you and the state, for example. Secondly, this mechanism is crucial because it directly engages with the government frame, especially specifically on opening government, that states morally owe reparation towards these minority groups because they get less representation or acknowledgement of their autonomous identity in the get-go. How does our frame of construction of these national identity work? As Stewie was clearly explains in his speech that no one in the latter government bench tries to agree or no one tries to contest or like engage on. First is that since this is not a THR motion, we ought to debate this within current status quo, where currently the construction of the coherent national identity is something that's progressive and inclusive in nature, something that finds common intersectionalities between these sort of like minority groups and the general society that sets their differences aside. This looks like how most Filipinos being portrayed to have common trait of being resilient, humorous, kind, filled with humility, etc. Secondly, we think that this is the main prerequisite to opening understanding and integration within these communities in the very first place before you get to nuance the uniqueness of their identities. This directly engages with the setups that Prime Minister talks about on how you form false identities, because we beg to argue that currently in status quo, people have a lot more in common than not. For example, this is where progressivism is evident. Evident and easily prominent. For example, in where you get easier integration within status quo because you see a lot of people like trying to clamor for the state because it's how it's reparatively or continuously trying to oppress more and more people. For example, how they see a more commonality when it comes to like their enemy, which is the state, for example. Thirdly, the way you integrate minority groups is through the construction of a national identity in which we bite the harm that the immediate impact is something that you risk in fighting because of unfair or unequal representation. We think that OG is right to talk about this, and this is where we engage in our worst case that OO just sidesteps. We think that this sort of infighting is the exact prerequisite for you to acknowledge these minority groups because they start to voice out what harmful shit the state is doing to to them and how they actively clamor for reparation and policy lobbying. We think that this is the exact missing analysis from opening opposition and how you get to let people meet each other in the eye and establish a clear common grounding based on common grounding based on same ideals. For example, at the very end of the day, such as the state oppressing them, such as how you fight for their autonomous identity. This directly engages with CJ's premise of how status quo is not currently working, because bro, it is. Even if it's slow, you still get media coverage, and a lot of people are currently hating on the state because of its continuous oppression towards other people. On the flip side, this is where I engage in completely to their CJ's so-called comparative or extension that you just build national identity based on your distinctive culture. First, I think they set themselves up to failure when they took a higher burden but never really proved how you get to achieve this. Notice how the type of national identity that member of government paints is very similar. These are the exact traits that I described earlier in my speech. How more likely they are resilient, kabayanihan, etc. Talk about the Filipinos. Secondly, I think that their premise is far more harmful. You continue to isolate these minority groups because you don't give a reason for the general society to acknowledge them in the very first place. Sure, on their best case, you get to assumptively give them autonomy over their own identity and culture, but you never give them the tangible reparations and such because you continuously get them engaged in the moral wrongdoings of the state, and you fix them, for example. But then thirdly, I want to disprove this, because if this is the premise that you're operating on, you're more likely to promote infighting because you never settle a common grounding on compromise. No one's want to sit down and have a talk. You don't simply see minority groups getting integrated within status quo. We agree on government web that people don't want to understand each other, and this is why we ought to have them meet eye to eye. Lastly, they never prove how you get to preserve these individuals and unique cultures on their comparative, when in the very first place, you risk them dying out in the first place because you isolate them further. You lock them out from the majority of the society. You're less likely going to secure their identity, for example. And I argue to flip the logic from government web. It's precisely because that you're situated in a post-conflict state that you need tangible reparations first, as opposed to having exclusion veiled as independence. Lastly, to put this in a nutshell, yes, there are immediate harms that come with the construction, but we think that the current progress that we have in status quo is something that's self-correcting, especially in the long run. The impacts are simple. Because you are primarily a post-conflict state, you need to have international help in order to grow as a developed nation. How this is mechanism is simple, because you're less seen as a political infighting sort of state. You're more likely going to invite help from other nations, which gives you more capital to develop your people and give reparation towards them. With all those reasons, never been prouder to stand in opposition.
Thank you for the fine speech, opposition whip. That brings us to the close of the